So you know already quite a bit about me and my work, and what kind of drives me in some of the analysis that I'm trying to develop. But I also would like to thank Professor Trotter for inviting me together with Wendy to this seminar, and I'm really delighted to see so many people here. This hasn't happened to me in a long time, I have to say. So the paper that I circulated in advance, in which we will be discussing today, grows out of a larger project, and Wendy already spoke to that a little bit, where I essentially analyze how young Soviet Jews experienced and then also remember their experiences during World War II, more than 60 years after the fact. So this was an encounter very much in the post-war period. So in my work, I really try to take into account the process of remembering as a process that is very much informed by the time that has passed since, social and political discourses that have happened since then, but also the very concrete personal encounter. And in that sense, my German identity actually played a large role for some of these conversations. And just to add to what Wendy was saying about my upbringing in East Germany and graduate school experience in the United States, another important link between that is actually a study in post-unification West Germany, where a lot of the conversations about commemoration and reparation about the Nazi genocide, to me, became a very, very different quality than I had encountered in previous years. And to some extent, and I think you've seen that in the paper, also inform how I think about some of the issues here, specifically in terms of how can we make good, can we actually make good, can we repair damages of the past. And so to some extent, that all kind of feeds into my conversation around survival and resistance during the Nazi genocide, but also how it is remembered. So in the book, which will be released in July, I essentially also show that what we generally call the Holocaust, the extermination of European Jewry, in the Soviet territories happened very differently than in many other regions. So for example, many Western European Jews were deported to concentration and extermination camps in the East, primarily Poland, but in the Soviet Union, in the German-occupied Soviet territories, most people were essentially killed on the spot in their hometowns or right at the outskirts of their hometowns. They were shot into pits, like at Babi Yar, or asphyxiated in gas vents and then dumped into mass graves. So we have a very different dynamic of the genocide that I'm trying to highlight here. And in that context, ghettos fulfilled a very important function. Essentially, they were the place of concentration, but also often extermination itself. And I think that also differentiates them from ghettos in other areas, for example, in Poland, German-occupied Poland, where ghettos often existed for much longer periods and had much more economic functions, and I'll come to that. So during my research, I was often struck by how survivors talk about their experiences of work in the ghetto, and also how they made sense of it, how they described what it meant to them to work for the Germans. And that encouraged me to think more concretely about the role of work for how people experience the world. And here, of course, a world of persecution and violence, but also how they see themselves within that world of violence. How do they conceptualize of themselves? And so in a way, I'm trying to develop a closer analysis of ghetto labor in order to find out to what extent the persecution of European Jews is distinct from other instances of persecution. On one hand, during World War II, so for example, ghettos in other areas, but also other contexts of oppression and marginalization in which people are subjected to forced labor, for example. So in a way, looking at ghetto labor, and I hope you got that sense from the paper, enables me, or I hope will enable me to think about ghettos as a specific form of persecution, but also how they are linked to other forms of persecution. And in that way, I'm trying to kind of develop a very detailed focus using very specific statements of survivors that I've collected over the years, but also looking to some more theoretical conversations around labor to develop that analysis. And I hope we can discuss some of those aspects later, although you've probably realized that this paper is very much a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. But let me now turn to the paper a little bit more concretely and contextualize more what I'm doing there. As I already said, my research very much focuses on ghettos in the German-occupied territories. And just to give you an impression of Belarusia, which is my specific area of interest, we see here that there were many, many ghettos, more than 190, and the scholarship is still ongoing. There's still more research to be done, and we'll probably actually find more ghettos that existed. But just to place our conversation in this kind of visual way, to give you an idea that there were many, many small ghettos, essentially, that all had a very specific function, primarily directed toward extermination. And I've developed Minsk kind of as an important case study, and we can see Minsk here will be in the middle, the capital of the Soviet Republic of Belarusia. Because Minsk is an important case study. It was the largest ghetto in Belarusia. It also differed in important ways from many of the other ghettos, but I think looking at it allows us to get an idea of the more broader function and dynamics within these ghettos. So Minsk was fully captured as a city very early on during the German invasion, namely on June 28th in 1941. And already by early July, the Jewish citizens of the city were ordered to move into a Jewish residential district. We call that the ghetto, and you can see here the ghetto territory marked. It's a fairly small space of a little bit less than a square mile. And in that very small space, between 50 to 80,000 Jews were herded together. And you can imagine that made for very crowded conditions. People essentially, as some survivors described it, slept underneath and on the table because people of up to 19 lived in one room that used to house maybe a family before that. People suffered hunger, cold, and illnesses in part because they were not allowed to bring a lot of movable property with them when they moved into the ghetto. The ghetto was surrounded by barbed wire, and you can see that to some extent here at the gate. That is an important distinction, that's why I'm highlighting that here, where we often have, for example, the ghetto of Warsaw was surrounded by a brick wall, which made it much more difficult for people to cross that boundary. And so the barbed wire was in some ways kind of porous. People could move back and forth, although always in danger. But it also allowed the German occupation regime to continually decrease the territory of the ghetto as soon as they killed a number of residents. So it was a very movable boundary in that way. That is an important moment to highlight here, and that we also see in a number of other ghettos in Belarusia, especially the smaller ones, which often were essentially just one building, a large school, a synagogue that functioned as a ghetto. So it wasn't necessarily a neighborhood that made up the ghetto. Like in other ghettos, Minsk had the so-called Judenrat, the Jewish council, which was a so-called Jewish self-governing body, but in many ways this was a group of people appointed by the German occupation regime that were supposed to help them essentially implement their policies, their decrees. And Minsk here is somewhat interesting, but I can't go into too much detail right now, in the sense that the Judenrat here was very interested in supporting an emerging underground resistance network that really distinguishes it from other Judenrat or Jewish councils and other ghettos that were often more interested in kind of reconciling with the German occupation regime, and through that to try to rescue people. In most cases that didn't work. Minsk, in another way, highlights the function of ghettos in eastern Belarusia. What I've given you here is essentially chronology of death. Because killing actions were very much part of the everyday life in the ghetto in Minsk. And you can see here that from the establishment of the ghetto in July 1941, beginning in late September and then in the fall, we have several major killing actions where residents of the ghetto were rounded up and taken to mass execution sites in Blagovщина, Trostinets, some smaller villages around the city. Then another major killing action in July 1942 where up to 25,000 people were killed within 3 days, so very similar to Babi Yar. And then in October 1943, the remaining approximately 2,000 residents of the ghetto were killed and the ghetto shut down. So you can see from 80,000 inhabitants to 0 in essentially a little bit more than 2 years, I think indicates very much the function of this ghetto as a site of segregation, concentration, and extermination. The Minsk ghetto was different from other ghettos in Belarusia in the sense that it actually did exist for more than 2 years, because most ghettos in eastern Belarusia existed only for a short time, especially those in the eastern region, which was under military administration throughout the war. Most ghettos were essentially closed in the spring of 1942. So just a little bit over half a year after the German invasion, Jewish communities in this area were essentially eliminated. And the reason why Minsk did exist for so long was closely tied to its location, but also as a site of production and administration that it took on for the German administration regime. So if you look at the role of labor specifically within that context, it becomes very clear that Jewish labor, ghetto labor in essence, in eastern Belarusia, but also in Ukraine and in other areas of the German-occupied Soviet Union, although somewhat distinct from the Baltic republics, we see that Jewish labor often didn't play kind of an economic role. It was very much more a form of discrimination, of humiliation, and violence, in the sense that often the tasks that were assigned to residents of the ghettos had no real production value, in the sense that people didn't produce anything or didn't contribute to, for example, the German war effort, but fulfilled kind of functions like moving piles of sand from one place to the next, but really didn't play a significant role for neither the German administration nor for the military effort, which is somewhat different in Minsk, where many Jews worked in workshops within the ghetto or outside factories, where ammunition was produced, where supplies for the German army were produced. But in that sense, Minsk, through its long existence, but also as a site of actual production, takes on a somewhat special role within the the Belarusian context. Generally, we have to say that Jewish ghetto laborers in Belarusia and in other Soviet ghettos were rarely paid. They did not receive wages or salaries. The only reason or the only remuneration that many of them received was food, although often also very meager rations were given out. So in a way, you see that labor here plays a very distinct role that is much more related to a system of segregation and violence. So, and if you look at how Soviet Jews related to that context, how they related to the fact that their labor was more a contribution to establishing a racist hierarchy than to productivity, it becomes very clear that labor plays a somewhat ambiguous role here. To some extent, that is because, of course, to work for the Germans provided food, so it was a very important moment because it saved lives, at least for a time. But it also was the moment where the segregation of Jews from their non-Jewish co-workers, so from the non-Jewish population, was constantly reiterated. And Michael Dresser, and you may remember that quote, describes that difference that emerged very clearly at the work sites, where he describes a lunchtime situation where he says, quote, "While we were eating our so-called soup, the Russians brought bread, lard, pickles, and on the side chewed on these unimaginable delicacies. We tried not to look at each other. They were also paid for their work, and we went home differently. They went to their families. We, in a column, toward our netherworld, where most of us has already lost their families." So you can see that even the context of work differed drastically for Jews and non-Jews in the occupied territories. A second moment that I feel is important to highlight here is that, of course, these workers were caught in a contradiction. On one hand, they worked to save their lives, but on the other hand, through their work, they also supported the regime that humiliated them and that eventually was aiming for their extermination. So there's, I think, an interesting tension or important tension that I would like to think more about, although, of course, the source basis here is somewhat complicated, because most of the survivors at this point have passed away, even the people that I've worked with. And in many other testimonies, people never bothered to think about those issues. So it's something I'm still struggling with, and maybe some of you have some suggestions. On the other hand, working within, but also especially outside of the ghetto, for Jews had other important functions. For example, for Rita Kashan, a woman who was 14 years old when the Germans invaded her home country, she essentially had to work in order to support herself and her brother after both of her parents had been killed. So she describes that working for the Germans really saved her life, but also her brother's lives, in the sense that they received food, often through the help of co-workers. But on the other hand, she also describes how it essentially opened up the prospect of maybe escaping the ghetto, in the sense that she encountered members of the resistance movement, of the underground movement, who asked her to essentially use her employment to collect bullets. She was cleaning the offices of German military members. And so she participated in that system, and in kind of reward, as a reward for her help, the Russian underground members promised her that they would take her out of the ghetto and her brother to the partisans, to groups of guerrilla fighters outside of the ghetto where she could survive. So in a way, work outside of the ghetto also enabled interactions that could potentially be life-saving. And Elena Drapkina, another young woman who also worked at the railroad yard, she describes the employment essentially as an essential part of her survival, in the sense that it provided an opportunity to exchange important valuables, clothing, for food, for basic necessities to survive. So we can see that work to some extent plays a somewhat ambiguous role, in the sense that it was part of a system of violence, but it also did offer opportunities that could potentially be life-saving. So the question, of course, is, and now I'm coming to the quote that is in the title of my paper, where Maria Boyko, another young woman, essentially says, describing her work in the Minsk ghetto, there was no work. We only worked for the Germans. So of course I was kind of flustered. I did not interview her personally. There was an interview by the Visual History Archive, also known as the Spielberg Archive. So the interviewer unfortunately didn't probe her more on what she meant there. But I think she's pointing at a very complex issue here that really makes us think about what does it mean to work in a context where you're not able to independently determine the purpose of your work and kind of the goals of your work, where it's not based on your own decision making, but merely, and of course in that situation it was very important, a way of extending the time that is given for you to live before you die. Essentially, it was very clear that life in the ghetto was not indefinite. So this is where I started to think about that issue of ghetto labor and kind of the meaning that people assign to it. And then started to look for other moments in which people talk about work and how they related to it during their imprisonment in ghettos, but also to some extent in camps. And then you've noticed that I'm also moving here into other sites of persecution. So Nina Romanova, for example, a woman that I interviewed, and unfortunately she died until I could take a proper picture of her, so I have a passport picture of her years before I actually met her. But she was obviously very much aware that her work for the Germans had not necessarily a purpose for herself, but rather reiterated this racist hierarchy in which she was placed as a prisoner of the Germans, in German-occupied territories, and essentially refused to work for them. She said, but after all that I had gone through, meaning she had lost her parents, she had lost 2 siblings, I did not want to work for them. And that's the moment where I think that we also can realize how work can also be a form of resistance, in a sense that not working, refusing to work, can be a moment of resistance, and that the notion of being able to choose to work, but also to choose to work for whom and in what way, often determines how individuals perceive their labor, and in some ways should be the starting point for further analysis. And then finally, and I'm repeating here, another quote that is familiar to you, Ruth Kluger, who some of you may know from her writings. She was deported to Auschwitz as a very young woman. She describes her work in the concentration camp Gross-Rosen and essentially compares it to slave labor, which I think is an interesting perspective, and also specifically invokes Karl Marx in her description, where I was like, hold it, I know something about Karl Marx. He thought about labor. So I took Kluger's statements as a suggestion that in order to understand the impact and the implications of the Nazi regime on individual lives, we need to look to the role of labor as a form of humiliation and violence, rather than looking for its productive value or production value that has often been at the center of investigations of ghetto labor, for example, in the Polish ghettos. But I think to that often kind of ignores the perspective of those who were subjected to that labor in focusing on the kind of quantitative aspects of work. And this is where I then started to look for conceptualizations of labor. And of course, if you think about the meaning of labor, we have to talk to Karl Marx, or have to look to Karl Marx analysis, and to try to figure out how we can think about labor in freedom and in unfreedom. And this is where the notion of alienation, I think, is very central, where essentially alienation is the moment in which labor for people has no value for themselves as individuals, to recognize themselves, but also to understand themselves as members of a community for which they work and which they help to reproduce. And that, of course, is the moment where ghetto labor is a form of alienated labor, because the Jews who were working for the German Nazi regime were not meant to be members of the community that would benefit from that kind of work. So this is kind of where I'm trying to use the framework of alienation to think about the role of labor and the meaning of labor that people assigned to it while they lived in the ghetto. And then the final notes, because I think my time is up. Another way in which Marxist or analysis informed by Marxist study may be potentially useful to think about ghetto labor is to think about the notion of social differentiation, where labor essentially figures as a way to make different, to divide populations into those who perform certain kinds of labor versus others, and through that are constantly also kind of repositioned in a marginalized status. And obviously immigrant labor is one of the very important moments to think about here. But it also reminded me of Nina Romanova's refusal to work for the Germans, precisely because she knew that she would, through her work, reiterate, reproduce a racist hierarchy. So the major challenge, obviously, in thinking about work in the Soviet Union during wartime is that we also need to take into account how did people think about work before the war. And this is one of the major tensions, and Wendy Goldman has much to say about that, is that before the war, in the 1920s and 1930s, labor in Soviet society often also took on characteristics that many people describe as unfree, in the sense that people were obliged to work, that they were punished for not working properly, not working long enough, and so often potentially also had a complicated relationship relationship to labor, even though, of course, it was not part of a system of violence in the same way as it was during the Nazi regime. But that is one of the moments that I think I need to look more closely into how do perceptions of work, how are they informed by previous experiences? How can people actually talk about those moments? So ghetto labor in the German occupied Soviet territories essentially was a very central element of the violent terror regime. The exploitation of ghetto labor here, as well as in ghettos of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, relied very much on the segregation of Jewish populations from their non-Jewish compatriots. And the segregation through barbed wire, sometimes in individual buildings, enabled the occupation regime to conduct killing actions during which the non-working population, meaning children, elderly, and many women, were divided from workers and then essentially marched to the execution sites. In that way, ghetto labor acquired a very vital function in the sense that those who did work for the Germans were left alive, at least for the time being. But on the other hand, of course, and I've already mentioned that I think quite extensively, is that ghetto labor also allowed to some extent to undermine the segregation when Jewish workers encountered non-Jewish workers outside of the ghetto. So in a way, ghetto labor takes on a very important moment for Nazi domination, but it also raises some more questions about the complex meanings of labor for people to understand themselves as victims of violence. And I hope we can have a discussion about that.